My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and continuing the Silmarillion Synopsis series, we now come to the Quinta, Chapter 7 of the Silmarils and the Unrest of the Noldor. And here we finally get to the start of the real conflict of the Silmarillion stories, or at least the conflict that is the backdrop of all the Silmarillion stories, and we start to get into some real action. It doesn't really get too action heavy yet. That'll come in the next few chapters, but we do get to some serious tension, and things are going to quickly build to a head from here and move on to, well, back to Middle-earth ultimately. So let's find out what happens with the Silmarils and the Unrest of the Noldor. To start with, we are told that Feanor is filled with a new thought, or perhaps has a foreshadowing of what is to happen later, and basically tries to conceive an idea of capturing the blended light of the two trees of Valinor and making them imperishable. And so he summons all of his skill, all of his knowledge, all of his, all the stuff that he's gained in the course of his lifetime in terms of being a craftsman and a jewel maker, and he makes the Silmarils. And basically it gives us a description of the Silmarils, which is, to an extent vague, because it can't really be too specific, because there's no way this would work in real life. But basically, the Silmarils are three great jewels with the outside is kind of like diamond. It's a clear crystal, but that's just like a housing for what's inside. It's not like a solid gem like we would normally think of. And inside is an inner fire made of the blended light of the two trees of Valinor. And it tells us that because of this, they shine on their own, even if they're, a completely dark room. But also, if any light hits them, it kind of takes them and then throws it back in a bunch of different colors. And basically, it's just an amazing, these are amazing gems or jewels. And the other thing it tells us is that the housing, which looks like diamond, is actually harder and stronger than adamant, and therefore no violence could destroy it within Arda. So they really are imperishable. They can't be destroyed. And as a result of this, you'll see why the foreshadowing matters in a couple chapters. I won't give that away here. But you probably already know. So anyway, he makes these gems, and then it tells us that Varda hallows the gems such that no mortal flesh or unclean or evil hands can touch them without being scorched and withered. So not only are they amazing, but now they've been kind of made holy by the Valar. And this is, kind of the pinnacle of all of the works of any of the children of Eru. So all the works of elves and men, this is the greatest of them all. Nobody ever managed to do anything like this or surpass this. And Feanor will later himself say, I couldn't even do this again if I wanted to, probably. And incidentally, it also mentions that he did this work entirely in secret, and so that becomes a little bit relevant later on. But the real story is what happens as a result of the creation of these things. Melkor, seeing the Silmarils, of course, being the bad guy that he is extremely envious of these things, and as a result begins to plot the downfall of Feanor specifically, but also kind of the Eldar in general, and wants to end the friendship between the Valar and the elves. So he starts slowly kind of spreading lies, and at first he does it kind of by, it tells us, subtly intermingling words with, in his conversations with elves, being so subtle that they don't even really realize that it's him doing it. They almost kind of remember it as their own thoughts coming to them naturally, but it's thoughts of, like, wide realms that they could rule in Middle-earth if they weren't in Valinor. They start thinking about all this kind of thing, and it grows from that to Melkor kind of giving them the idea that the reason that the Valar brought them to Valinor was basically because they were afraid that elves left in Middle-earth would become too great and powerful for them to govern, and they wanted to keep them in Valinor where they could basically keep them under their thumb, and they would be able to control the race of men, which came later because they would be the weaker of the two races. And it tells us, I don't remember if it's exactly in this chapter, but it tells us somewhere that this actually turns out not to be true. It's really kind of, they have a harder time influencing men than elves, and so that's kind of backwards. It also tells us that Melkor, being so engrossed in his own doings in the music of the Ainur when he was creating discord, that he really wasn't paying much attention and didn't really get much of an idea what men would be like. But at this point, none of the Valar have talked about men other than Melkor, mainly because they don't really know when they're coming or what's going to happen. Much like with elves, they didn't know when they were going to show up, and they kind of put off doing anything until the last minute. So, because Melkor is the first person to reveal this, the elves do feel like they've been kind of lied to and whatnot. The other major lie that he starts to kind of spread is to sow dissension specifically between Feanor and Fingolfin, and Feanor, who, by the way, apparently is also the person most affected by the idea of, I could rule realms out in Middle-earth. Feanor is starting to get word from people that Fingolfin, being the elder of the sons by Finwë's second wife, and therefore Feanor's younger son, younger brother, but not of the same mother, Fingolfin may be trying to usurp his place as kind of like the heir to King Finwë. Fingolfin, on the other hand, is getting word from elves that Feanor, being the haughty, proud person that he is also not too happy with Fingolfin, which is kind of true, but that this may lead to some rather nasty things happening. So both of them, again, kind of spurred by Melkor, they start making weapons. And this is a new thing in Valinor. They've never been weapons, at least in the hands of the elves. There might have been from like the war that the Valar waged against Melkor, but since the coming of the elves, there hasn't really been any need for weapons. So this is a new thing, and it's rather discouraging. And it tells us that before the Valar were aware, the peace of Valinor was poisoned. There start to become serious murmurings among the elves, and eventually Feanor even goes so far as to speak openly of rebellion against the Valar, and things get worse from there. Finwë, being troubled by all the goings-on, summons all of his lords to a council. Fingolfin kind of gets there first, basically because he wants to talk to Finwë about this whole situation, and he basically says, Feanor, rightly so named, meaning spirit of fire, is causing a lot of trouble. Can't you kind of keep him in check? And then Feanor walks up soon after that and basically takes this as confirmation of what Melkor had been spreading lies about, which is that Fingolfin is trying to take his place as first in everything, and he says, so you want to be first even with my father. Fingolfin basically just says nothing, bows to Finwë, and walks out the door, but Feanor follows him, catches up at the doorway just outside, and stops him and basically draws a sword on him, puts it to his chest, and threatens him, basically saying, if you try to do this again, you're dead. Lots of people see this because Finwë's house is basically in the center square, and this, the Valar, being aware of the general unrest of the Noldor already at this point, now have something that they really have to act on, because all of this is kind of publicly known, and they're like, okay, we got to do something now. Fingolfin, after being threatened, had just walked away once again without really saying anything, but the Valar hold a council. Feanor and Fingolfin, of course, are both called to it, and they don't really know exactly the cause. They're kind of assuming Feanor is kind of at the bottom of it because he is a prideful person, and he's, not exactly the happiest person either. He's, some of that could probably be put down to his upbringing and the loss of his mother when he was born. But so they start this council with the assumption that Feanor is probably at the bottom of it, but eventually they do realize, after much discussion and discovery of what happened at the back of all this, that Melkor really is the prime cause. So Tulkas, therefore, is sent to go find him, which he doesn't because Melkor, having already figured out his time was running short, ran and escaped from any possible arrest. So, in the meanwhile, the rest of the Valar are also discussing Feanor, and because Feanor did some stuff that, to the extent that Melkor influenced it, you could hold him somewhat uh, free of blame. There were still some things like pointing a sword at his brother's chest that they can't really pass over. And so they basically say, well, because of this and some of the other things that you've done that are really bad, um, you are going to be banished from Tirion for 12 years. And so, with his 7 sons, Feanor leaves Tirion to go to another place further north in Valinor, and Finwë, who of course loves Feanor the best of all of his sons, decides to leave with him. In his absence, Fingolfin ends up ruling Tirion as kind of like acting king, more or less, which again, in Feanor's mind, kind of seems to confirm Melkor's lies, even though it's really Feanor's own fault to begin with. So there's still tension there, although there is some indication that things might turn out okay, because when Mondos pronounces the doom of the Valar regarding Feanor, he says at the end of the 12 years, everything will be held, redressed, and forgiven if others will release you. And Fingolfin straight up says, I will release my brother. So you get the idea that Fingolfin just wants to put all this behind him, and it might turn out okay. But it doesn't. As I mentioned before, Melkor had kind of hidden himself to avoid being captured by Tulkas, but when Feanor and his sons and Finwë all move up to another abode further north in Valinor, he decides that he's going to try to kind of get in with Feanor. And incidentally, I don't think I mentioned this in my previous videos, but we've already actually learned that Feanor really doesn't like Melkor, which is kind of a necessary backdrop for this little part of the story. Melkor comes to the gate and speaks with Feanor and tries to kind of cajole him into joining him, and he's kind of making all these arguments and saying things like, I'm a Vala too, I know how these guys operate, and he's playing on the whole thing that he's been banished unjustly, and all these things that are already kind of eating away at Feanor's mind. Feanor is, thinking, can I trust him far enough to help me escape from Valinor? And while he's thinking about this, Melkor is seeing that he's kind of wavering, and so he says, well, he kind of throws his last dice at this and says, you have a strong place here, but don't think that these gates will keep the Valar from claiming the Silmarils. Thinking, of course, to play on Feanor's the strongest feeling he really has, because it tells us earlier in this chapter that he's become really possessive, downright greedy about the Silmarils. So Feanor, hearing this, kind of suddenly sees through Melkor's, facade and realizes that what he really wants is just the Silmarils himself. And so he says, "Get thee gone from my gate, thou jailcrow of Mondos." And I bring up the exact quote because it's rather interesting. This is something that occurs several times throughout Tolkien. When you see thee and thou, that's not just archaism. We tend to think of those words as just archaic ways of saying you. They're not. Thou and thee are the familiar way of saying you. You is a more formal, thou is a more, I'm on par with you, or you're even my lesser. So like if you've studied Spanish, for instance, su would be the formal, tu would be the informal. So when Feanor says this, he's basically putting Melkor at a level much lower than he actually inhabits within the realm of Arda, and basically just shuts the door in his face. And it tells us that he slammed the door in the face of the greatest being in Arda, which is why that thou and thee are so important. He is basically saying, you may be a Vala, but you're no better than me. Which Melkor isn't too happy about. It says he leaves in shame. He really wants revenge, but it's not time yet. So he basically, by the sheer force of the situation, has to leave. He leaves through the Kalakiria, the valley in this encircling mountains that the the Valar had created for the city of Tyrion on the Hill of Tuna, leaves Valinor and begins to plot his revenge from the outside. Now, the next chapter will come back to the elves and what happens between Fingolfin and Feanor, so do stay tuned for that, but you can already tell things are getting set up for some rather interesting events. So now we finally have, after several chapters, the gems on which the name of the Silmarillion is based, and already they're causing major strife, and there's lots of things going on. So things are getting really interesting now. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was useful for those of you who either didn't really get the Silmarillion the first time or just haven't been able to read through it because it is a rather different style. If you do enjoy it, then please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. You can support the channel at my Patreon link, which will be in the description below. And you can also, of course, subscribe over here and find a couple of my previous videos here. Of course, I will also link to the playlist for the Silmarillion synopsis so you can keep up. And until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.